All right, everybody, welcome back for another deep dive.
Yeah.
You know how it is, right? You're scrolling through your phone. You're just trying to get a handle on what's happening in the world.
Oh, yeah.
And it's just like information overload. It can feel it's just coming from all sides. And it's just really tough to know, like, what can you trust and what can you actually believe?
Oh, for sure. I mean, like, we are absolutely drowning in information.
Yeah,
Like, it is everywhere, and we really do need a whole new set of skills to figure out how to swim through all of it.
totally. And one of those skills that I'm really fascinated by, and I think is probably one of the most important ones, is really understanding the concept of sourcing.
Absolutely.
And so that's what we're diving deep into today, because we know you're busy. You want to get smart on all these topics,
Yay.
but you don't want to spend all day wading through, research papers and articles. So we've gone and done that for you.
Yeah. Happy to do it.
Right. We're going to bring you like the core insights on this really important concept about how we as humans actually evaluate and judge information.
That's right. And what's so cool about this particular topic is that it brings together all of these different areas of research. There's the education side, there's psychology, there's information science,
Mhm.
and we're really looking at how we understand and evaluate the things that we read and really how we make sense of text by looking at where it comes from.
Yeah.
And this deep dive that we're doing for you today is based on a really comprehensive review article. It's called Sourcing in Text Comprehension, a review of interventions targeting sourcing skills. And it was written by Eva Buenos-Bronte and Helge Thurströmso, and it was published back in 2018 in the Educational Psychology Review, so a little while ago, but still super relevant today.
Okay. So let's get down to brass tacks here. What are we actually talking about? What does sourcing mean? Like when we're reading something, how do we actually do that?
Yeah, so sourcing is really just thinking about the information about a document or a text. So things like, who wrote it, what type of text is it, when was it written? All those things are about the document, not the actual content itself.
Right. So it's like looking at the context
Yeah, exactly. It's like, what are all the things surrounding?
behind the words. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. All of those things surrounding the words, and that can really help you make sense of the information and evaluate it and, think critically about it.
Yeah. And it seems like this is such a fundamental skill now in this world that we're in, because like it used to be that, you would have these gatekeepers, you would have these established institutions like publishing houses, news organizations that had a reputation to uphold.
Yeah.
And so you could kind of maybe give them the benefit of the doubt and just trust them. But now it's like
Yeah.
anybody can publish anything online. And so it's like it's shifted the burden to us now to figure that out.
It really had. You're right. And the OECD, which is, an organization that looks at, economic and social well-being around the world, they've actually identified, the highest level of literacy
Right.
as including not just finding information and understanding it, but also being able to actually judge whether those sources are reliable,
Right.
which is a pretty significant shift from what, we might have considered literacy to be in the past.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. So we've got a huge responsibility here. And what's interesting is this research is kind of showing that we're not always doing a great job of sourcing information.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the key takeaways here. And, there are a few ways that this kind of plays out. People might just completely ignore
Yeah.
where information comes from. They're just reading it and they're not even thinking about who wrote it or when or what the context is. Or they might just not really think deeply about what that source means for the actual content. They might kind of superficially acknowledge it, but not actually use it to really evaluate what they're reading.
Right.
So that's one issue. And the other is that, people really do just kind of rely on those mental shortcuts and heuristics. They're busy.
Right.
They don't have time to do a deep dive on every single piece of information they encounter. So they're looking for those quick cues and signals to tell them whether something is trustworthy or not.
Right. So can you give me some examples of
Yeah.
like how does that play out? Like what would be a heuristic that somebody might use?
Yeah, so just a simple example might be, you see an article shared on social media and you just assume it's trustworthy because it comes from a website that you've heard of.
Right. Like the name
Yeah.
sounds familiar or something. Yeah.
Exactly, but you're not really looking into, what's the reputation of that website, who's the author, what are their credentials.
Yeah.
You're just kind of going with that familiar feeling. And another thing that people might do is choose to believe a document that's actually less relevant to what they're looking for just because the source seems more authoritative on the surface.
Right.
So, maybe it's got, fancy language, or it comes from an institution that sounds impressive, but the information itself might not actually be that useful or accurate.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is, people can be really influenced by their own personal experiences and biases.
Right.
So, they might be more likely to believe information that confirms what they already think,
Right.
regardless of whether the source is actually reliable or not.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's kind of like we're trying to be efficient with our thinking,
Mhm.
but sometimes those shortcuts lead us down the wrong path.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is that this idea of sourcing really pulls insights from a few different fields, like I mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
So there's the social psychology side of things, which is really all about how we're persuaded by different sources. And, there's a long history of research showing that if we believe a source is credible,
Right.
meaning, they're knowledgeable and trustworthy,
Yeah.
we're just more likely to be swayed by what they say.
Makes sense.
And then within that field, there's this idea of dual process theories of persuasion,
Yeah.
which suggests that, sometimes we really do think carefully and deeply about a message,
Yeah.
but other times we're just using those heuristics, those shortcuts, because, we don't always have the time or the mental energy
Yeah.
to really analyze everything.
And so a credible source just becomes that easy button.
It does. It's like, oh, this person seems like they know what they're talking about.
I'll just trust them. Yeah.
I'm just gonna believe what they say without necessarily, digging into the arguments or the evidence.
Right.
And a classic example of that is like trusting a doctor's advice.
Right.
Without, necessarily understanding all of the medical science behind it.
Yeah.
Just like, okay, this person is a doctor. I'm gonna go with what they say.
Right.
But, if we're really motivated and we have the capacity to do it, then we can, actually pay attention to both the source and the content and really think critically about it.
Right.
But the key is that initial impression of the source is really powerful.
Okay. Yeah.
It really sets the stage for how we process the rest of the information.
So that's the social psychology side of it.
Yeah.
What about information and communications research? What's their take on how we evaluate sources, particularly online?
Yeah. So in that field, they're really interested in how we make judgments about the trustworthiness of online information.
Yeah.
And similar to social psychology, they recognize that our motivation plays a huge role.
Right.
So, if we're looking for information that's really important to us, like something about our health or our finances, we're probably going to be more careful about evaluating those sources.
Well, and if we're just, browsing social media for fun.
Right. Higher stakes mean higher scrutiny.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But there's a concern that in general, internet users might not be putting in as much effort as they could into really evaluating the credibility of what they find online.
Right.
The internet is just this massive, complex ecosystem and can be so hard to figure out who to trust and what to believe.
Yeah.
So people might rely on things like, how the website looks, or whether other people have recommended it, or if the information seems consistent with what they've seen elsewhere, or, even just their gut feeling about whether the source seems biased or not.
Yeah.
But the worry is that those quick judgments might not always be accurate.
Right. So both of those fields are kind of highlighting that the source really matters, but also that we're not necessarily like digging in and really, doing our due diligence when it comes to evaluating that source. So what about literacy and discourse research? What's their perspective on all of this? Yeah, so that perspective is really focused on how our understanding of a text is shaped by what we know about its source.
Okay.
So it's not just about, deciding whether to believe something or not. It's about how that source actually influences how we process the information, how we interpret it, and ultimately how we comprehend it.
Okay, can you give me an example of that?
Yeah, so think about reading a news report versus a scientific study on the same topic.
Okay.
Knowing the genre of the text, that one is written for a general audience, the other one is written for experts.
Right.
That's going to influence how you read it, how you understand it.
Yeah.
Similarly, knowing something about the author's background or their potential biases can really shape how you understand their perspective.
Okay.
And there's some really fascinating research by a guy named Sam Weinberg who studied how historians read historical documents.
Okay.
And he found that expert historians, they spend a lot of time thinking about, who wrote this document?
Yeah.
When, why, all of those questions about the source. to help them understand the context and the potential biases that might be present in that document.
Yeah.
Students, on the other hand, they tend to treat those documents as just straightforward accounts of facts,
Right.
and they often overlook the importance of the source.
So it's like reading between the lines.
Yeah, exactly. They're not just looking at the content. They're really trying to understand the story behind the story.
Yeah.
And this research has led to the development of something called the Documents Model Framework, or DMF.
Okay.
And this idea suggests that when we read multiple texts about the same topic, we're not just building a mental picture of each individual text, but we're also building what's called an intertext model.
Okay.
And it's kind of like imagining that you're tagging information in your mind with where it came from.
Right.
So you can see how different sources relate to each other, why they might have different viewpoints.
Right.
It's like building this mental map of the conversation around a topic,
Got it.
with each source kind of represented.
So it's a pretty sophisticated way of reading.
It is. It's definitely a higher level skill. And the DMF suggests that we're more likely to engage in this kind of deep sourcing when it's really important for the task that we're doing.
Uh-huh.
So if you're writing a research paper, for example,
Right.
you're probably going to be more careful about considering the sources of your information.
Yeah.
Or if you come across, information that contradicts itself,
Right.
paying attention to those sources can help you figure out why those contradictions exist and which information you should actually trust more.
Okay, so just to kind of bring this all together, can we define sourcing like in a really practical way for our listeners?
Yeah, absolutely. So for our purposes, we can think of sourcing as actively identifying and understanding the features of a source.
Yeah.
So things like the author, the publication, the purpose,
Right.
and using that information to help us predict what the content might be about, how to interpret it, and then how to evaluate, its credibility and its relevance to what we're trying to learn or do.
Yeah.
It's really about being a mindful reader.
Right.
And understanding that where information comes from is just as important as the information itself.
Totally. Okay, so we've established what sourcing is and why it's so important.
Mhm.
And you mentioned that even young children, show some selectivity in who they trust for information.
Yeah.
So how does this ability to source information actually develop as we get older?
Yeah, it's really fascinating to see that, even at a young age, kids aren't just believing everything they hear.
Right.
They do show some preference for learning from sources that have been reliable in the past.
Yeah.
But as we, navigate this increasingly complex world of information, we do need more sophisticated strategies.
Mm-hmm.
And there's research that's compared how different age groups evaluate search results online.
Yeah.
And it's found some really interesting developmental patterns. So younger kids, they tend to focus on more superficial features, like the title of a website,
Right.
or where it appears in the search results.
Okay.
Whereas more successful adult learners, they pay more attention to things like the website's domain name,
Mhm.
other indicators of its origin, and its potential bias.
Right, so it's moving beyond the surface to really understanding the structure behind it.
Exactly. And the research suggests that this ability to really critically evaluate information while we're reading it develops gradually as we go through school.
Right.
It's not, a sudden shift. It's a skill that's honed over time with experience and with instruction.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so that brings us to like the really crucial question here. How are educators trying to teach these sourcing skills? And then even more importantly, is it actually working?
Yeah, this is where that review by Brante and Strumsa is so helpful.
Yeah.
Because they looked at, 18 different studies that all aim to improve students' sourcing abilities.
Right.
And these studies span from elementary school all the way up to university.
Okay, so a really broad scope.
Yeah, really trying to get a sense of, what are the different approaches that are being used and what does the evidence tell us about their effectiveness?
Right. Okay, so what were some of the general trends that they saw across all of these studies?
Yeah, so one common approach, particularly in studies with younger students in elementary and lower secondary school,
Right.
was to really focus on teaching them how to evaluate the credibility of sources.
Okay.
And a lot of these studies involved having students work with multiple documents
Yeah.
that presented, slightly different or even conflicting information.
Okay.
And they often used these inquiry-based learning tasks where students had to, investigate a question
Right.
using these multiple sources.
Uh,
However, one thing that the review noted is that these studies didn't always look closely at how students were actually identifying or paying attention to specific features of the source.
okay, so they were measuring whether the students could make a judgment,
Yeah.
but not necessarily how they got to that judgment.
Exactly. So it's like, they could say, okay, this source is more credible than this one, but they weren't necessarily unpacking like, well, how did you arrive at that conclusion?
Got it. Okay, so let's look at some specific examples then. So what were some of the interventions that they were using?
Yeah, so there was a range of interventions. Some were led by teachers and integrated into the regular curriculum in subjects like, math, science, social studies, language arts.
Okay.
And these varied in length, from just a few hours to longer programs that span, many weeks.
Okay.
And one challenge that some of these teacher-led studies faced was ensuring that the teaching methods were implemented consistently across all the different classrooms that were involved.
Right, because it's, real world. You got lots of different teachers.
Exactly. It's much
Huh.
harder to have that tight control that
Yeah.
you might have in a more, lab-based setting.
Right.
Then there were also, shorter interventions led by researchers, and these were often just 1 or 2 lessons, and they weren't always directly connected to what the students were learning in their regular classes.
Got it.
And some common teaching activities included things like, working with websites,
Yeah.
using worksheets that had prompts to get students thinking about the source,
Yeah.
direct instruction from the teacher where they modeled, how to evaluate a source,
Right.
and then also classroom discussions about, credibility and sourcing.
Got it. And what were they using to measure whether this was actually
Well,
working?
yeah, so they used a variety of different measures. Some of them looked at how well students could explain why they thought a source was credible or not.
Okay.
Some of them had students rank different documents in terms of their trustworthiness.
Okay.
Some of them looked at whether students could accurately connect information in a text back to its original source.
Uh-huh.
And then some of them also looked at, overall learning gains. So, did the students actually learn more about the topic that they were studying?
Right.
And sometimes they measured that through essays or tests.
Okay, so what were the results like for those younger students? Were they seeing positive effects?
Yeah, so it was a bit mixed, actually, especially in elementary school.
Okay.
When it came to tasks that specifically asked students to evaluate sources or websites,
Uh-huh.
the results were a bit inconsistent.
Okay.
But there were more encouraging results in lower secondary school, where some of the interventions did lead to improvements in students' ability to judge credibility, their memory for source information, and their capacity to link what they were reading back to where it came from.
Yeah, okay.
Interestingly, one study that involved a much more substantial amount of instruction, like 60 hours,
Wow.
actually showed a really strong positive impact on students' sourcing skills.
Okay.
And one area that wasn't really explored as much with younger students was how understanding the source might affect their ability to construct arguments.
Okay, so focusing on kind of the basics of credibility in those younger years, what about upper secondary school? How did the interventions change when you looked at the older students?
Yeah, so in upper secondary school, the interventions often had broader goals,
Okay.
particularly in subjects like history, where sourcing was seen as a really important part of developing historical thinking skills.
Right, so more than just, is it true, but also like, what's the perspective? What's the context?
Exactly. It's like, understanding that history is not just a set of facts,
Right.
but it's also about interpretation and perspective.
Mm.
And so these interventions often involve teachers, sometimes for longer periods, embedded within the curriculum.
Okay.
And they frequently involve students working with, a larger number of documents, often presenting different perspectives
Yeah.
on a historical event or issue. And activities included things like, writing argumentative essays, explicitly teaching strategies for comparing and contextualizing sources,
Right.
using worksheets to guide their thinking modeling by the teacher classroom discussions about how to evaluate the expertise of different sources.
Right, and so for those older students, how did they measure whether those interventions were successful?
Yeah, so they often analyze students' essays looking at, how well they used evidence from different sources,
Yeah.
how sophisticated their arguments were. They also used questions that specifically asked students to apply those historical thinking skills.
Okay.
And interestingly, there weren't as many studies that focused solely on credibility at this level.
Yeah.
The focus was much more on, how sourcing contributes to deeper understanding and better argumentation.
Right.
And the results were generally more positive, showing improvements in students' ability to justify their credibility judgments, their overall sourcing skills,
Okay.
their historical knowledge, their reading comprehension, how effectively they use documents in their writing, and the quality of their arguments,
Wow.
including their ability to, integrate multiple sources and perspectives.
Okay, so that sounds pretty encouraging.
Yeah.
What about at the university level then? So for those higher ed students, what were the interventions looking like there?
Yeah, so interventions in higher education were typically shorter
Okay.
and led by researchers rather than teachers.
Got it.
And they often focused on evaluating information in specific fields like medicine or science. And they almost always used online sources.
Yeah.
And a lot of these studies involved, giving students a specific set of documents to work with and asking them to complete some kind of inquiry task.
Right.
Some interventions also incorporated, computer-based tools that prompted students to think about the credibility and the validity of the sources that they were using.
Right.
Some studies used annotation tools to help students kind of visually map out arguments and their evaluations of different sources.
Oh, yeah.
And in some cases, students were given, checklists or templates to guide their source evaluation.
Got it. And so how did they know if those interventions were working for the higher ed students?
Yeah, so they looked at a variety of things, including how students cited sources in their essays,
Okay.
their answers to questions about the content, how well they remembered source details, their reasoning for their credibility judgments,
Yeah.
how they ranked different sources, whether they paid more attention to reliable websites, and the quality of their overall understanding and argumentation.
Okay.
And while the general trend was towards positive effects, there were fewer statistically significant differences compared to the studies with younger students.
Right.
However, providing students with those prompts that really encourage them to evaluate sources
Yeah.
did seem to have a positive impact on, how they use sources in their essays
Right.
and their ability to justify their credibility ratings.
Okay.
Some studies did show significant improvements in, how students reference sources, how they ranked credibility, their attention to reliable websites, and the accuracy of their mental models of the information. Interestingly, one more comprehensive intervention that included a lot of different activities didn't actually show a significant effect on the overall quality of argumentation, even though students performed well on individual tasks during the intervention.
Okay, so it seems like there's a lot of nuance here, right? Like teaching sourcing skills can be effective across, different ages and subjects.
Yeah.
But there are these subtle differences in how it works and how it plays out.
Yeah.
So what were some of the key takeaways from this whole review? Like, what are the really big picture insights that you think our listeners should remember about sourcing and how it's being taught?
Yeah, so one really important takeaway is that while the interventions did address all aspects of what we defined as sourcing, earlier,
Yeah.
actually teaching students to use source features to really interpret the meaning of content was less of a focus.
Okay.
And it also proved harder to measure.
Right.
So, it's one thing to be able to identify the source. It's another thing to actually use that information to really make sense of what you're reading.
Right.
Another key point is that the instruction really needs to be relevant to the tasks that students are actually doing.
Yeah.
If they don't see the connection between why they're learning about sourcing and how it's going to help them in their schoolwork or in their lives in general,
Right.
they're probably not going to be as motivated to learn it.
Makes sense.
The review also found this consistent positive link between using multiple documents, especially those that offer, different or even conflicting perspectives,
Yeah.
and better learning outcomes.
Makes sense.
Which makes sense because it forces students to think critically about why those differences might exist.
It makes it a real question then, right? Like,
Yeah.
I need to figure this out.
Exactly. It's not just like,
Yeah.
here's the information, take it or leave it. It's like,
Right.
okay, well, why are these two sources saying different things?
Yeah.
What can I learn from that?
Yeah.
The review also raises this important question about, the fact that most of these studies used pre-selected documents, which, allowed the researchers to control the types of sources that students were exposed to.
Right.
But it doesn't really reflect the reality of, searching for information online.
Right. It's a very curated experience.
Right.
Yeah.
So more research is needed to understand how well these skills transfer to situations where students have to find their own sources.
Right.
Additionally, the review suggests that, adapting the complexity of the documents to students, existing knowledge and reading abilities could also be beneficial.
Right.
And then the use of inquiry-based tasks, especially in higher grades, also appears to be a promising approach for developing sourcing skills
Okay.
because it gets students to really grapple with how knowledge is constructed in different fields.
So it's like thinking about thinking.
Exactly. It's like, what are the rules of the game in this particular discipline?
Yeah.
How do we decide what's true, what's not true?
Right.
What are the criteria for evidence?
Yeah.
And that kind of thinking can really help students understand the importance of source.
Got it. Okay. So they're understanding the nature of knowledge itself.
Yeah, and there's also this connection between what students believe about knowledge, was called their epistemic cognition,
Right.
and how they evaluate sources.
Right.
And we saw this kind of shift in focus from just judging basic credibility in lower grades to more complex considerations about interpretation and perspective in higher grades,
Yeah.
which makes sense developmentally.
Right.
And it's also interesting to note that even relatively simple tools like providing students with information and worksheets to guide their thinking could be quite effective in some cases.
Okay.
You don't always need these fancy interventions.
Yeah.
Sometimes just giving students the right information and the right structure can make a big difference.
Got it.
And then the mixed results with those longer teacher-led interventions might highlight the challenges of, implementing new teaching methods consistently and maintaining student engagement over extended periods.
Right.
It's hard to keep that momentum going, especially when you're working with, real-world classrooms and all the constraints that come with that.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. So, we're throwing a lot of information at our listeners here, but what are the like 2 or 3 things that you really want them to walk away with?
Yeah. So I think the big takeaways are, first of all, sourcing is a critical skill.
Yes.
It's essential for navigating today's information landscape.
Absolutely.
The research shows that teaching these skills can be effective
Yeah.
across different ages and subjects.
Right.
Using multiple sources, especially those with different viewpoints, is a really valuable teaching strategy.
Right.
And even simple supports can make a difference.
Yeah.
But we also need to remember that students' motivation and their understanding of why sourcing matters are just as important as their ability to do it.
Absolutely. And, that's really what we want to leave you with today. Understanding how to evaluate sources empowers you to be a more informed consumer of information.
Yeah.
It's about being able to unlock those moments of deeper understanding when you realize how the origin of a piece of information really shapes its message.
Absolutely. And so here's a little challenge for our listeners.
Okay.
The next time you come across some information online, take a moment to just pause and think about the source.
Yeah.
Who created it, why, what might their perspective be,
Right.
and really reflecting on those questions can change how you understand and engage with information in the future.
Yeah.
And so we encourage you to make this a regular habit, explore the origins of the news and the information that comes your way.
Yeah. And if you're curious to delve even deeper into this topic, or you want to explore that original research paper that we mentioned,
Yeah.
we'll link to it in the show notes. And, this deep dive is really just the beginning of a much more profound understanding of how we make sense of the world around us.
Absolutely well said.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks, everybody.
We'll catch you next time.